Everything began in January 1947 in Hollywood, which had already become the center of the film industry. The city was shaken by a horrific event. A young, aspiring actress, Elizabeth Short, was found dead. This case is considered America's most famous unsolved case, or rather, it used to be. That's because not far from where Elizabeth Short was found lived a wealthy but very unhappy family named Hodel. As it turned out, they had several dark secrets that hold the key to what happened not only to Elizabeth, but to dozens of other girls in Hollywood. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to talk about how the family of one famous surgeon in Hollywood in the 50s is connected to the Black Dahlia case. In 2017, half-sisters from the Hodel family named Yvette and Russia went to the storage unit where their mother, Fauna, who had just died of cancer, had been renting a small space for her belongings. Fauna was a very interesting woman with a complicated life, so for 30 years she had ordered everything that happened to her on a tape and in notebook, conversations with family members and friends, important events, and her own thoughts. She was writing her biography and the story of her family. After death, all her recordings and personal items were left in that small storage unit, which her daughters came to clear out. The sisters rummaged through the dusty space, sorting through family photographs, opening one heavy box after another, and flipping through diaries where Fauna had written down her poems and reflections. In one of the boxes they found dusty tapes which turned out to contain recordings of their mother's conversations with certain members of her family. For example, one tape was labeled with the name of Fauna's mother, Tamar. One that interested the girls most was titled "Now I Am Free." They immediately put it into the player. On the recording, Fauna's voice was still very young.
And now I am free. From the age of 12, I knew my story would be written. Why? I had a mother who was a drunk. She detested me and I detested her drinking. Mama was black and I was white. Growing up in the late 50s and early 60s with such odds, I knew if we outlived the circumstances, this would be a story to tell. One lie, one little white lie, caused me to fight for the rest of my life.
Fauna was raised in a black foster family by a woman named Jimmy. She learned at the age of 5 that Jimmy was not her biological mother. Her foster mother told her herself about Fauna's real biological family and how Fauna, still an infant, had ended up with her. Times were very different than the early 50s. Segregation was widespread, and if a white woman was about to have a black child, it was considered better to give the baby up for adoption. At that time, Fauna's foster mother, Jimmy Lee, worked as a cleaner at the Riverside Hotel and Casino in Nevada. One day, a woman approached her there and asked whether she wanted a baby. The stranger explained that the daughter of her friend was soon going to have a child, a girl, Black. Jimmy was shocked and didn't take the offer seriously at first, but after some time she agreed. She felt sorry for the baby, and besides, she was promised a decent reward. They said the child came from a very wealthy family, so they wouldn't leave her uncompensated. Jimmy's husband was a very religious man, and since they had no children of their own, he saw this whole situation as a sign from above. Jimmy also had a strong alcohol addiction, and her husband believed that the child might have helped her to stop drinking. That baby was Fauna Hodel. Her biological mother, Tamar Hodel, was only 15 at the time. When Jimmy came to the hospital to pick up the child, she saw that the baby wasn't black at all. Fauna was a blue-eyed blonde, but Jimmy was assured that she would grow darker over time. After taking the girl home, Jimmy renamed her Patty, so Fauna Hodel became Pat Faison, and she grew up in Sparks, Nevada, in an all-black family living in a black community. Unfortunately, there wasn't a single day where Jimmy didn't have to explain why she had a white child. Despite all the assurance, the Fauna was mixed race, and that's what was written on her birth certificate. She remained a blue-eyed blonde. Later, Fauna would carry the birth certificate with her everywhere, so people would stop questioning her skin color. She desperately wanted to be like the other children in the neighborhood, and in the summer, she would lie in the sun for hours trying to get at least a little tan. Jimmy, Fauna's adoptive mother, contrary to her husband's hopes, continued to drink even after she took Fauna. Under the influence of alcohol, she would completely lose control, becoming very aggressive, so Fauna's childhood wasn't particularly happy. When the girl was 12, Jimmy Lee, in yet another outburst of anger, threw her out of the house. And for the next 3 years, Fauna lived with an uncle, with an aunt, and even spent time living in someone's car. At 15, Fauna became pregnant and gave birth to her first daughter, Yvette. Around the same time, she began to wonder whether her life would have been better if she had grown up with her biological mother. In 1969, Fauna Hodel started searching for her biological mother. She wrote a letter to the hospital where she had been born, but they replied that they had no information. They also added that her mother hadn't personally given up to the child. She was very young, and under the insistence of her own mother, Fauna's grandmother, she decided to place the baby for adoption. Hearing this, Fauna didn't give up and soon learned a very important fact. As it turned out, her mother was from Los Angeles, not San Francisco, where Fauna had been born. The young woman took a phone book and called every hotel in the city. Finally, going through the numbers one by one, she reached a distant relative, and he gave her the address of Fauna's grandfather, who lived in Japan. She wrote him a letter, and a few weeks later, her phone rang. The man introduced himself as George Hodel. He told her that Fauna's mother, his own daughter, lived in Hawaii, and also gave Fauna her phone number. Fauna was 20 years old when she finally dialed her biological mother, Tamar. Tamar was shocked by the call. She hadn't expected it, but the question Fauna asked in the very first minute of their conversation stunned her even more. Fauna asked whether her father was really black, and Tamar, after a brief pause, admitted that it wasn't true. Fauna's father was white. The legend had been fabricated by her mother Dorothy, Fauna's grandmother. Fauna was placed with a black family because Tamar, disillusioned with white people and their cruel culture, hoped that the baby would grow up in a black environment far from what was happening in the homes of white elite. It was very difficult for Fauna to accept the truth about her origins, but Tamar in fact had suffered deeply too after giving her daughter up for adoption. After the birth, she wasn't even allowed to hold her daughter. They simply showed her the baby through glass and then took her away. And for the next 20 years, Tamar remembered her, regretting about the decision. But now they had found each other and they had a chance to make things right. However, every family has skeletons in their closet, and the Hodel family's closet was only just beginning to open. For 2 years, Tamar and Fauna spoke on the phone, and eventually Fauna saved enough money to visit her biological mother in Hawaii. Together with little Yvette, they packed their bags and flew to Tamar. Their meeting was very emotional, even though Tamar arrived at the airport a full 5 hours late. Once they arrived, Fauna started noticing some strange things about Tamar. The house was very dirty, the air smelled of weed, and in the middle of the room sat Tamar's 3 sons, aged 7, 5, and 3. The first one was named Peace, the second Joy, and the third Love. All of them were by different men. Tamar also had an older daughter. She was 18. Unlike Fauna, Shirley was mixed race, and her name was Deborah Elizabeth. However, surprisingly, she introduced herself as Fauna. As it turned out, Tamar had taken the separation from her first daughter very hard, and took out her anger on Deborah, who had no choice but to become for her mother that very lost daughter Fauna. Tamar told her daughter about her family, including her grandfather, George Hodel, whom Fauna had been speaking with on the phone. George was a brilliant doctor, a scientist, and overall a fairly well-known figure in Hollywood, where he had lived for a long time before moving to Japan. But despite his brilliance, he did not treat his family well. That evening, Tamar didn't go into much details, but she told Fauna something truly disturbing. According to her, Grandpa George had been the prime suspect in the case of Elizabeth Short, tragically known as the Black Dahlia. The case was widely known, and Fauna immediately understood what she meant. Elizabeth's case remained unsolved for decades and became an integral part of criminology. On January 15, 1947, the police received a call from a woman who had gone out for a morning walk with her child and reported that a young woman's body had been found in the Leimert Park area. According to her, the position in which the body lay was so unnatural that for the first few seconds, the woman thought it was a frightening mannequin. Near the body, detectives found a high heel print, a cement sack with traces of blood and traces of gasoline, which had been used to wash the body. To identify the victim, the police contacted the FBI. They identified Elizabeth Short fairly quickly by her fingerprints. At the time of her death, Elizabeth Short was only 22 years old. Her body had been cut in two at the waist and completely drained of blood. Some organs, for example the intestines, had been removed and neatly placed beneath her buttocks. The most frightening detail was the damage to her face. The had slashed both sides of her face from the corner of her mouth to her ears, creating a Glasgow smile. Elizabeth's body was clean, washed, and prepared for burial, which led detectives to conclude that the murder had been committed elsewhere. One detail that immediately stood out was that the torso had been separated from the body using a specific surgical technique that makes it possible not to damage the bones. A criminalist named Ray Pinker, who worked on the case, even called in surgeons and then confirmed that the cut matched a medical procedure known at the time. It was taught in medical universities in the 30s. An ordinary person would not have been able to know and do all of that. Elizabeth's mother learned of her daughter's death from journalists at the Los Angeles Examiner, who immediately joined in covering the mysterious case. Reporters called the woman to pry for details about the girl's life and then delivered the horrific news. The more the journalists learned about Short's life, the more aggressively they began to portray her in the media as a woman of loose morals. Journalists gave the victim the nickname the Black Dahlia, a reference to the popular film at the time, The Blue Dahlia. Rumors about her love life were fueled by police reports. One of them stated,
"This victim knew at least 50 men at the time of her death, and at least 25 men had been seen with her in the 60 days preceding her death. She was known as a teaser of men."
According to medical examiner, Short's body had lain on the vacant lot for more than 10 hours before it was discovered by the woman. It was assumed that Elizabeth had been raped before she was killed. The first suspect in the case was a young man named Robert Manley. He was the last man the girl had been seen with shortly before her death. However, multiple examinations and polygraph tests did not confirm his involvement in the case. Sometime after the investigation began, mysterious messages started arriving at police station and newsrooms. A week after the body was found, a man called the examiner and introduced himself as Short's killer. He said that as proof he would send the journalist Elizabeth's personal belongings. Soon, such a package did indeed arrive at the editorial office. It contained Elizabeth's birth certificate, photographs, business cards, and the victim's address book. The items were accompanied by a letter the killer had assembled from magazine cutouts.
"I will give up in Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Do not try to find me."
However, the items did not become the evidence because they had been wiped down with gasoline, so they carried no fingerprints. At one point, more than 750 investigators were working on this case at the same time, and among 150 suspects was George Hodel. The investigators had already knew his name because he had been a suspect in another case but was found not guilty. So who was this George Hodel? George Hodel was born in Los Angeles in 1907. He was the only child in the family and he was adored. The boy was called a genius practically from birth. He seemed talented at everything. From an early age, he studied music, played the piano, and even gave concerts at the age of 9. But he didn't love music, and he hated his mother, who forced him to practice and forbade him from playing with other children because she was afraid George would damage his musician's fingers. When his mother died, the boy immediately forgot about music lessons and never returned to them again. George was extremely intelligent. He got top grades at school and even went down in Los Angeles history as the child who scored the highest marks on public school exams. In high school, he took an IQ test, scoring 186 points. He entered the California Institute of Technology at the age of 15. But he wasn't only smart, he was also very amor. In college, George almost immediately began an affair with his professor's wife. She became pregnant by him, left her husband, and moved to Massachusetts. The young man followed her there, wanting to marry her and raise their child together. But the woman simply mocked him, and George never saw her again. The rejection affected him deeply, and what finished him off was that when he returned to Los Angeles, he learned that he had been expelled from the university because of the affair. Hodel then decided to devote himself to art. He began publishing his own newspapers where he wrote about surrealism, a love he would carry through his entire life. He looked for countless hidden meanings in the art and wrote about them in his paper. At the time, Hodel was only 17. George desperately wanted to be a man of art. He surrounded himself with artists and creative people, but he himself did not succeed in art, and it infuriated him. So, leaving surrealism for house parties, George went to medical school, trained as a surgeon, and started working at a medical center that was essentially a venereal disease clinic. And in the 30s and 40s, sexually transmitted disease was extremely common. It was believed that 10% of the US population had been diagnosed with syphilis at least once, and that 20 to 40% had gonorrhea. STDs were heavily stigmatized and were often associated with prostitution prostitute woman. And if an illness like that was discovered in a politician, his career could collapse almost immediately, unless, of course, the information could be covered up. On that basis, George Hodel became a very influential doctor. He knew about the illnesses of Los Angeles' wealthiest residents, and he happily began using his position for personal gain. Only many years later, detectives did learn that Hodel sometimes deliberately gave patients the wrong diagnosis, attributing disease to them that they didn't have in order to exploit their connection and extract money from them. He also knew all the Black Channel contacts for clinics and doctors who perform illegal abortions, which gave him even more influence. At that time, George hired a secretary who accidentally learned about his dark dealings and decided to go to the police. But after she admitted her intentions to George, she died. One evening in 1945, George, while being at his secretary's house, called his wife and asked her to come over. He handed her written proofs of his illegal actions and asked to burn them. Then, after waiting for a while, he took his unconscious secretary to the hospital where she died 20 minutes after arriving. The court found him not guilty, probably because of bribes and some sort of connections. So the famous doctor calmly returned home, and in 1946 the family moved to a very unusual place. It was a unique building the family nicknamed the Franklin House. The house had been built in 1926 by the son of the legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and the Hodel family would live there until 50s. From the outside, the house looked a bit strange and frightening, and that was exactly what George Hodel liked. He loved everything unique and slightly creepy. By 1949, George and his wife were living in the house with 3 sons, Steve, Kelly, and Michael, as well as Tamar, George's daughter, with another woman, Dorothy Bob. This was the same Tamar Fauna would travel to Hawaii to see 2 decades later. But back then, Tamar was still a teenager, and her mother decided it would be best for her to live with her father for a while. That's how she ended up in that strange house. Little Tamar quickly found a strange pastime. She would sit completely naked on the porch in front of the house, pretending to be a statue. And when passers-by came closer, she would suddenly move and scare them. Her father, George, pretended not to notice anything unusual. He only forbade her to sit naked outside once the police took notice. In general, according to the son's recollections, George was a rather cold and strange man who didn't particularly like children. He frightened them, for example, by pretending to be God speaking through a loudspeaker mounted on the wall. And the best family time the sons had with their father were rides in his army jeep. However, once they arrived to the destination, George would get out of the vehicle, forbid the boys to leave the car, and sometimes they sat in the back seat for hours waiting for him. As it later turned out, George used that jeep to visit his mistresses. He believed that sex was the main force on the planet, controlling absolutely everything. Orders were constantly taking place in his house, and his wife participated too. He called her Derera, so as not to confuse her with another woman of his who's also named Dorothy. And it's unclear whether she participated voluntarily or not, because it is known for certain that Derera was afraid of George. By the way, they divorced back in 1946, but she and their sons continued to live in George's house. The Franklin house became a gathering place for his surrealist friends. Alcohol, drugs, and sex accompanied every party. George Hodel invited surrealist artists and photographers to his home, people he adored. He seemed to know everyone working in Los Angeles at this time. He also allowed his friends to photograph Tamar naked. George's sons don't remember those celebrations at home very clearly. They were little boys. Some recall only beautiful women in luxurious dresses, and sometimes without them, and the vague figures of men who weren't shy about doing whatever came into their heads. 14-year-old Tamar unfortunately remembered it much better, because her father brought her to every party. Tamar saw a lot, but one day something terrible happened. George called her into his room and telling her it was a great honor, undressed. Tamar was expected to do whatever he told her. She complied, feeling ashamed and disgusted. When it was over and she had come to her senses, she told her mother everything, but she, unfortunately, didn't believe her. And George had no intention of stopping. He told Tamar it was her privilege and that he would, in his words, make a woman out of her. Before long, Tamar became pregnant. George seemed to find it amusing. At first, he wanted her to have the baby, but later he sent her to a friend of his for an illegal abortion, one that, at the time, was performed without anesthesia. Tamar realized she had to go go out of that house. George's wife, Devera, confirmed it, casually telling Tamar that George had killed his secretary and was capable of anything. Tamar managed to escape, but the police found her. She was hiding at a friend's place, and she told the officers everything about what had been happening to her, the abuse and the illegal abortion. Now George Hodel was officially charged with moral offense. During search at his house, police found a lot of strange photographs and porn materials, to which George replied that this was the way he was trying to understand love. The trial began in 1949. George hired the best lawyers in Hollywood, and the key witness against Tamar turned out to be her own mother. She called Tamar a pathological liar, and since it was coming from her own mother, the court sided with George Hodel. So it turned out George won the case not only against his daughter, but against the truth itself. And as he was leaving the courtroom, George shook hands with several jurors, which may point to certain arrangements. Besides her mother's words, something else also damaged Tamar's credibility. During questioning, Tamar told the police that her father was actually the killer who attacked Elizabeth Short. Whether she overheard something from the officers or heard conversations at home is unclear. However, that only reinforced her image as someone who made things up. Having failed to get justice, Tamar grew up deeply traumatized. In the future, she would have 5 children by 5 different men. The first would be Fauna Hodel, whom she gave up for adoption, and Fauna's father would remain unknown for a long time. There were rumors that it could well have been George himself, because Tamar became pregnant literally a year after the trial. Now, let's move further along the Hodel family tree and pay attention to one of his sons by Dorothy Houston. We're interested in Steve Hodel, who spent his entire career in the police from 1963 onward, solving more than 300 cases, mostly murder. He is now retired, but no less active when it comes to investigations. And we'll jump a little forward in time. In 1999, the phone rang in his home. It was June calling, George's 5th wife. She was crying into the phone and begging Steve to come as soon as possible. George Hodel was dead. He was 91 at the time, and behind him were 5 marriages, in which at least 11 children were born. When Steve arrived, he learned that his father had died after taking an excessive dose of medication, meaning it was intentional. At home, beside George, they found a note in which he instructed his wife to get rid of all his belongings. June followed his final request, but she decided to keep one thing. She gave Steve the family photo album. She simply couldn't bring herself to burn it. Steve took the album and started looking through the pictures. Along with family photos, one image caught his attention. It showed a beautiful, dark-haired young woman who was not a member of their family. For some reason, a name immediately surfaced in his mind: Elizabeth Short. By the time Steve joined the police, the Black Dahlia case had long gone cold and was used mainly as a training example. It felt as though no one had any real intention of solving it. Steve recognized the photograph because he remembered Elizabeth's face from newspapers, stories, and from the case being discussed during police training. So why did George have this photo? Steve went home and nearly forgot about the album and that picture. But a week after his father's death, his phone rang again. This time it was Tamar. A father's death is a heavy blow, and the siblings decided to get in touch. Before that, Steve and Tamar had barely spoken. During the call, Tamar mentioned that their father had once been a suspect in the Black Dahlia case. Steve was startled and even a little offended, but he decided to look into it. The first thing Steve looked into was the letters. The person who attacked Elizabeth Short and dozens of other women as well had been sending strange notes to newspapers and to the Los Angeles Police Department for years. When Steve saw them, he was horrified. He recognized his father's handwriting. He even submitted samples for a handwriting analysis. The results matched. Steve also learned the investigators had suspected from the start that the killer was a doctor, and George, as we know, was a surgeon. Still, it could all have been a coincidence. When people learned that Steve had taken an interest in the case, the daughter of one of the detectives who had worked it 50 years earlier gave him crime scene photographs. Steve was struck by the way the victim's body had been positioned. He could tell the killer was trying to say something through the pose, but he couldn't figure out what. As he kept thinking about it, Steve remembered one of of his father's close friends, the famous surrealist artist and photographer Man Ray. Ray and his wife often visited the Hodels. They were part of the parties in the house, and Man Ray became the family photographer, taking portraits of them. George and Man Ray talked endlessly about art. Like many surrealists, Man Ray treated the female body as an object, material for art. He wanted to shock, to push boundaries, to be the boldest in the room. And George Hodel, in turn, desperately wanted to be like him. Then, one day, as Steve was leafing through books of Man Ray's work, his gaze stopped on a photograph titled Minotaur. It showed a woman, or rather a woman torso, with her arms raised just like Elizabeth Short's. Steve couldn't believe what he was seeing. A work titled Lips of the Love reminded him of Elizabeth's permanent smile, and another piece echoed the scalpel-like cuts. The similarities were so specific that even art historians, after viewing the crime scene photographs, agreed the parallels were unusually close. But there was more in the police archives. The Los Angeles Police Department had kept recordings from microphones installed in George Hodel's house. It turned out his home had been bugged. The microphones were planted by an officer named Walter Morgan while George was out being questioned. Morgan and a team of specialists broke into the Hodel house and set up the listening devices. Those recordings were preserved only because one detective secretly hid the files in a safe, and over time they were simply forgotten. And it was those hidden Black Dahlia materials that many years later ended up in the hands of the prime suspect's son, Steve Hodel. In general, the disappearance of files, recordings, even entire case folders was common in Los Angeles in those years. Police departments were so corrupt that almost anything could be bought. Bribes were everywhere, and officers who refused to take money often faced retaliation and sometimes lost their jobs. That may be one reason Elizabeth Short's case was never solved at that time. The first thing Steve learned from the files was that during the trial involving Tamar, one of the witnesses, Lillian, had lied. She testified that Tamar had not had an abortion, yet the archive stated plainly that Lillian herself had previously told detectives about Tamar's abortion. Lillian was terrified of George Hodel. He had threatened to take her children away if she told the truth, so she lied under oath. The files also indicated that Hodel paid his lawyer, who then paid off the judge. In the end, Lillian was preparing to tell the prosecutor that she had lied, but she simply was too afraid. Steve also found witnesses' statements that were altered. For example, one witness swore that George knew Elizabeth Short had been crossed out, and above them someone written did not know Elizabeth Short. Finally, Steve found transcripts of the recordings from the bugs in George Hodel's house. On the very first day after the devices were installed, Hodel was heard speaking with a man who had a German accent. This conversation took place 3 months after George's trial, one he had easily won, as we remember. The recordings also captured terrifying screams. A woman was screaming from the basement. The screams didn't last long, though. Steve believed that Hodel and his German friend attacked yet another woman that night. What's striking is that detectives were hearing all of this in real time. The screams, the sounds of blows, yet they did nothing.
7:35 p.m. Hodel and a man with a German accent had a long conversation. Hodel the German.
This is the best payoff I've seen between law enforcement agencies. You do not have the right connection. I'd like to get a connection made in the DA's office. Any imperfections will be found. They have to be made perfect. Don't confess ever. 2 and 2 is not 4. We're just a couple of smart boys. They're out to get me. 2 men in the DA's office were transferred and demoted because of my trial. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. Realized there was nothing I could do. Put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Call Georgia Street Receiving Hospital right away. Expired at 12:39. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her. Maybe I did kill my secretary.
8:20 p.m. Sounded as though 2 men went down steps and entered the basement and began digging. Something was referred to. Not a trace. It also appears as though a pipe was being hit. "8:25 p.m. Woman screamed. 8:27 p.m. Woman screamed again. It should be noted that a woman was not heard before the time of screaming since 6:50 p.m. She was not in any conversation and not heard of again until the time of letting out these two screams. 8:40 p.m. German leaves the house, escorted to the door by Hodel.
George met several more times with the German who had been at his house on the day the police began recording. In those conversations, Hodel often talked about Elizabeth Short and also admitted that he wanted to leave the country. At that point, Hodel was clearly afraid of something. This was in 50s, and a few days after the last recording, George Hodel left Los Angeles. He would spend the next 40 years in Hawaii, Japan, and the Philippines. He quite literally became a different person, and of course, he started a new family. George Hodel was never arrested. He was untouchable, despite all the evidence and recordings. In the end, they weren't even considered, despite the fact that they contained what were essentially admissions. Still, his son Steve Hodel decided to go further. He learned that the archives of the University of California contained some secret files about the historic house where the Hodel family lived in the late 40s. Steve went to look through them and found a folder labeled with his surname.
Inside, there were preserved receipts for materials used to renovate the house. Several of the receipts bore the dates January 9th and 10th, 1947, 5 days before Elizabeth Short was found. So what were the residents of that house buying in early January 1947? Bags of cement, as well as packages of fertilizer, of the very same brand and size as those found near Elizabeth Short's body.
Steve published a book about all his findings, and in 2017 he received a letter from a reader. The woman wrote that her father had been a police informant and enclosed one of his letters. In it, her father said that he had known a certain man. He didn't write the name, only the initials GH, which could well stand for George Hodel, and he said he knew this man as the Black Dahlia's killer. He feared that this man would do something to his daughters, which is why he wrote about him and about the murder in this letter, but it was to be opened only if something happened to his children. He also wrote that the police knew that man's name. So now all arrows pointed to George. Only one test could put a final point in Steve's investigation. Several years ago, at an exhibition devoted to Elizabeth Short, Steve noticed some envelopes. As we remember, the killer had sent letters to newspaper editorial office and to the police. On one of those envelopes, dated by the way on George Hodel's birthday, a small stamp had been stuck, and to stick a stamp onto an envelope, you have to lick it. Steve had already managed to obtain samples of his father's DNA, and after discovering that stamp, he immediately wrote to the Los Angeles Police Department, asking them to process the saliva on the stamp, extract DNA, and compare it with the George Hodel sample. However, the police refused, citing a lack of resources. But Steve doesn't give up. Although he admits it's very hard for him, he has spent more than 20 years trying to solve this case, and even his relatives think he's become obsessed. But Steve simply wants justice. In any case, George Hodel lived a long life, admitting to nothing and never apologizing to his children. One would think that with George's death, the horrors in the family would end, but the cycle of violence is not so easy to break. Tamar began to copy his sadistic tendencies. Perhaps she was too deeply traumatized by George, or perhaps over time, echoes of her father's dark nature surfaced in her. Once, when Steve was talking to Tamar on the phone, she said something strange.
Sorry about that awkward incident in bed.
Steve didn't understand what she meant, and Tamar explained that when they were both living in the Franklin house, they had been intimate. Steve was horrified. He didn't remember anything like that. Tamar was 13 at that time, and he was 8. Tamar's other brother, named Kaylee, met the same fate as well. In other words, Tamar apparently did to them what she had seen what had been done to her. Tamar grew up in a very beautiful young woman. Many compared her to Marilyn Monroe. After giving birth to Fauna and placing her for adoption, Tamar became pregnant again and gave birth to her second daughter, Deborah Elizabeth, who would later become the second Fauna. The second part of her name, Elizabeth, was given to her by her grandfather, George Hodel. Later, Deborah learned that she had been given that name in honor of Elizabeth Short. Tamar constantly took anger out on Debbie and forced her to buy and bring her drugs. Tamar also had a close friend, Michelle Phillips, from the famous group The Mamas and the Papas. The two of them used illegal substances together, and Debbie witnessed all of it. In addition, Tamar tried to take her own life, but after the failed attempt, she completely lost herself. She started doing to Debbie what her father had done to her, saying that she was trying to calm her down. Later, she began bringing people home, friends and strangers alike, and selling Deborah to them. This continued until Debbie was 15, when she herself gave birth to a child. Debbie remembers her grandfather George coming to visit and making her write strange essays. For example, a 12-page composition about female breasts. He also would only give Tamar money when he could spend time with his granddaughter. And once Debbie was sent to his hotel for lunch, the George gave her some kind of drink, after which she fell into a deep sleep. She doesn't remember what happened that day, but she remembers her grandfather undressed with the camera turned on. Tamar, of course, knew everything. She herself sent her daughter to George. In addition, Tamar constantly told Debbie about her beloved daughter Fauna, the very one she had been forced to give up. And at 12, Debbie asked her mother to start calling her Fauna. By the way, almost the same thing happened to Tamar's boys, Love, Joy, and Peace. Among the other things, they were allowed to smoke and developed a healthy perception of sexuality because of what they saw at home. And in the future, they would need therapy just to somehow cope with everything that George Hodel and their own mother had done to them. Tamar had an explanation for everything. According to her words, which are on the tape found in the storage unit, she simply didn't know how else to live. Having lived through hell as a child, she didn't understand how it could be done differently. She thought she was doing what was best for her children. She kept repeating that she loved them, but Fauna didn't believe her. So it turns out Fauna was simply very lucky that she was placed with an adoptive family. Who knows what would have awaited her in the Hodel's household. Today, the youngest part of the Hodel family is trying to move forward. Fauna Hodel lived a long and happy life and died in 2017, and her daughters made a podcast telling her gripping story. The series was produced based on her memoirs, and Steve Hodel is still trying to get the DNA testing done to compare the samples. Fauna's father still remains unknown, but a recent DNA analysis confirmed that George cannot be her father. So at least in that respect, everyone can breathe a little easier. So guys, that's the story. Please write down in the comments what do you think, and see you next time.